Welcome back to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and insurance markets meet. This is a new special episode in association with Muir Analytics. The theme is hotels as targets, data-led malicious risk underwriting. I'm David Benyon, and I'm joined by an expert guest. Jeff Moore is Chief Executive of Muir Analytics, providing threat intelligence for corporations and insurance companies to reduce exposure to severe financial loss from malicious risk, political violence, war, insurgency, terrorism, and like perils. The SecureHotel Threat Portal, which is really at the core of this conversation, is a groundbreaking security and insurtech product combined into one. It's a one-of-a-kind risk and threat assessment tool for hotels to help protect staff, guests, property, revenues and brands against terrorism, war, political violence and criminal violence. Dr. Moore is a recognised subject matter expert on hotel risk mitigation, as well as in the field of intelligence and irregular warfare. He has a PhD in Thai counterinsurgency strategies and tactics from the University of Exeter, published as The Thai Way of Counterinsurgency. Before that, he worked as a defence analyst and a security consultant. He supported the US Army's Plans and Operations Division in the Pentagon, and the US Department of Defense's force transformation efforts. He's also taught counter-terrorism at the National Defense University in the US. Jeff has been published in a wide array of magazines, including Jane's, Proceedings, Small Wars Journal, and Naval History. He's also an authority on World War II amphibious warfare and wrote the book Spies for Nimitz, published by the US Naval Institute Press. So, why is this conversation important? Well, because hotels are among the top targets for political violence, this year most conspicuously from a war risk perspective, hit by Iranian missile and drone attacks in the Gulf monarchies. But there's also a much wider range of malicious risk perils here, from an enormous amount of criminal violence up to terrorism attacks from Thailand to Tunisia, and civil unrest from the United States to Nepal, all of which we will delve into in this episode using case studies drawn from the SecureHotel Threat Portal database. And when the damage from all these perils, using all the data from these case studies, is added up, which is part of the intelligence that Muir Analytics and the Threat Portal provides, the result is that we see the hotels industry is the world's most violent retail business sector. Right, let's get into it. Jeff, welcome to the pod. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one. It's great. I mean, it's an interesting topic. I think hotels really are in the thick of it. And we see that in the current conflict in the Gulf. We've seen luxury hotels being targeted in Dubai and elsewhere. And obviously different types of assets exist within a political violence book of business, but hotels are really important. And the different variety of threats we're going to get into, I think, makes for a fascinating topic.
I do too. And too bad we can't do this over a pint in a pub, some Fuller's London Pride to move things along, but a Zoom meeting is good enough.
Yeah, we'll do that another time.
Yes, we will. We will.
Just let's get settled in and so people can understand a bit more about your background and what it is that you do. So you've worked in national security before and you've worked in academia and now CEO of Muir Analytics. So yeah, how has your background led you to focus on violence affecting hotels? And what leads you to think underwriters could do with some better intelligence on this?
I've been a defense contractor for the vast majority of my career. I originally worked for Science Applications International Corporation. I had a top secret clearance and a courier badge. So I went a lot of places and did a lot of things. And eventually they put me in the Pentagon. And when the war on terror started, my cell in the Pentagon, we were attached to the Army G3. We were sitting alongside the green suiters, as we called them. And we would process intelligence and see what contingencies might pop up that the Army would absolutely have to deal with. And in the process of doing all this, hotels kept popping up as being targets of terrorism. And eventually later on, when I decided to hang out my own shingle and do my own thing, after getting a PhD from the University of Exeter, by the way, in irregular warfare, and my field work was in Thailand, hotels popped up all the time. So eventually we decided to put together a database on hotel violence. And we discovered that hotels are most likely the world's most violent retail business sector. Now, there might be a few more bar fights between Moscow, London, New York, and Houston on a Saturday night, but I'm talking about people getting injured and having to go to the hospital or the morgue, major to even minor property damage, but it happened all the time. And you're also looking at brand damages when you talk about violence at hotels. And so we discovered that in the US, for example, there's anywhere between 60 and 100 acts of violence at hotels in the US every single month. And internationally, it's 20 to 40 and sometimes more. And this is only what you see in the press. So security and insurance are mandatory for all hotels, even if the security and the insurance isn't that sophisticated. And because it's such a violent sector, we saw an opportunity to actually do something positive with data science and to help hotel security and hotel insurance.
It's also tremendously glamorous. I always just think of the night manager and a bit of glamour. But again, that does relate to the strikes, right? Civil commotion, Arab Spring type stuff in the beginning of that, the Carrie drama.
Right.
Speaking about this from an insurer's perspective, how patterned or predictable is hotel violence? And what are some of the biggest things that insurance companies and their insureds, do you think they misunderstand about it?
I think that hotel insurance regarding covering violence is incredibly misunderstood because there's not a lot of data science on it. And, the core of the issue is there's a cacophony of underwriters under the Lloyd's umbrella who believe in underwriting art. And then there's a growing group of people who believe in, yes, using underwriting art, but let's augment it with data science, right? So collecting information on whatever it is, shipping, war zones, terrorism, et cetera, and using that to give us a little more insight, or in some cases, a whole lot more insight on the risks and perils that are occurring in these sectors. Again, shipping, hotels, shopping malls, whatever you're covering. And for us, we started to see incredibly stark patterns regarding especially criminal violence. Criminal violence is the most popular form of violence at hotels all over the world. So some of the patterns are just, for example, drunk and disorderly conduct in the parking lot, or drug and disorderly. So you would have somebody staying at a Motel 6 somewhere, and it doesn't have to be a big city. It can be rural America as well. Drugs, alcohol problems, somebody's in the parking lot, they start a problem with somebody else, somebody pulls a knife or a gun, or there's assault and battery. That kind of thing happens very frequently. Another kind of violence that we see at hotels happening very frequently is parties gone bad. It doesn't have to be some big, elaborate hotel room party, for example, in Vegas. This happens at small hotels in the hinterlands in the US and internationally. And it can happen in Washington, D.C., right outside, where I live right now. It reminds me of, there was a party in Washington, D.C. a year ago where a young lady didn't want her soon-to-be ex-boyfriend to come. He found out about the party and came in with a firearm and opened up and shot people through the door. So these kinds of things happen all the time. And then, of course, unfortunately, sexual assaults is pretty high as well. And then there's drug deals gone bad. There's prostitution deals gone bad. And we see this prominently, statistically. About 2/3 of hotel violence globally, but especially in the US, happens at the 1 and 2 star level. And about 1/3 of the hotel violence happens at the 3, 4, and 5-star hotel level. So there's all sorts of trends like this that we see on a constant basis.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's so much to get into. And yeah, it's obviously part of this malicious risk conversation, should we say. So let's get into the data that you've developed. So please just provide an introduction to the SecureHotel Threat Portal, what it is and put together, before we then can get into some case studies a bit later.
Sure. Yeah, we do call it the SecureHotel Threat Portal. And what it is the world's largest, most sophisticated hotel violence database. And we track hotel violence globally by, of course, your static metrics such as day, time, place, star ranking of the hotel, name of the hotel, address, latitude, longitude, et cetera. But we also track the more dynamic issues at hand. For example, what were the actual tactics that the perpetrators used against the hotel or against someone at the hotel? So, for example, we've got a section on physical assaults, which covers assault and battery, which is with fists and feet and headbutting and even biting and things like that. And then we also cover deadly weapons, which is anything from a knife or anything that will cut or stab, shootings, blunt instrument attacks, like a cricket bat or a baseball bat or a table leg, or even using hotel furniture. And then we've got strike, riot, civil commotion. We follow terrorism, which includes anything from stabbings and bombings to complex attacks like what we see in Mogadishu, or hearkening back to the days where LET attacked the Taj Mahal Hotel, the Oberoi, and the Trident in Mumbai in 2008.
Yeah, I remember it well. I stayed in the Oberoi once many years ago. Yeah, it's a lovely hotel. So how many of these case studies have you got in there?
Great question. We're looking at 3,600 plus.
Wow.
And we're starting now to use artificial intelligence to help us with some of that data entry. It's not super easy. It takes a lot of prompting, but once you get a good system down, it works very efficiently. So we think that it will be adding another 500 to 1,000 in the next couple of months. So the data set is incredibly highly structured and it is exceedingly robust.
Amazing. So who are you working with? You might not want to talk about specific entities, but types of entities. Who are the primary beneficiaries of this intelligence?
We've entered into a strategic partnership with Providers Risk Management Association, which is a collection of risk mitigators or risk advisory consultants like myself, attached to a managing general agent, an MGA insurance company in the Chicago area. And our job is to help the clients of this MGA who purchase insurance for violence coverage, for example. We help them with mitigation procedures, security. We help them with risk and peril awareness. And overall, the goal is to decrease violence or prevent violence before it happens, number one. And number two, if violence does occur, make sure that the hotel is squared away to the extent possible regarding crisis management. So they can protect their guests, they can protect their staffers, their buildings, and their revenues. So in keeping with our work with providers, we are actually starting up an initiative to provide assault and battery data and insights to this particular MGA and to the big insurance company backing this MGA, which is under the Lloyd's umbrella. And so circling back around to codify all this, the main clients for our data would be hotel security managers and the risk managers. So for example, you've got hotel security and risk managers at the top of a major hotel chain, pick any one, Marriott, Omni, Hilton, Hyatt, Intercontinental Hotels, et cetera. And then also insurance brokers and insurance underwriters that also focus on the hotel sector. They would be the main clients. But we will also be able to extend our intelligence, and coming from the Pentagon sector, we refer to this as risk intelligence or threat intelligence. We would be able to extend that intelligence to governments to help certain governments protect their travel and business sectors, their tourism sectors, airline corporations, because airline crews are getting off planes and they're staying in hotels and whatnot. And they are really big on not just airline safety and airport safety, but the safety and security of their air crews. And then we've got travel companies like TUI that get people on planes, they send them to these environments, they send them to these countries like Tunisia. And this harkens back to the risks and the threats that occurred during the 2015 assault by an ISIS gunman at the Imperial Marhaba in Sousse, Tunisia. The travel companies need to know what the risk and perils are in these travel environments, these hotel and resort environments as well. So we've got a wide array of clientele that we can center on. And on top of that, last but not least, there's anywhere between 500,000 to 700,000 hotels all over the world. And again, all of them need some measure of security, whether it's locks on doors and lighting, and some measure of insurance. And we can really help improve the gaps that exist in this market regarding less than adequate security at hotels, because they tend to be lagging, and helping the insurance sector get a better handle on the risks and perils that occur in this unfortunately violent sector.
When we were preparing for today, you made clear, and some of your previous remarks just a moment ago, that criminal violence is the dominant category globally. Why do you think that risk still gets less attention than terrorism, let's say, in the hotel sector?
The bottom line is it's not that dynamic. And to put it in rough terms, and we used to say this at the Pentagon a lot, it's not that sexy, right? So if you are working on some logistics issues at a corporation or the Pentagon or what have you, or some budgetary issues, it's not the most dynamic job to have if you're going to be in that environment. A fight in the parking lot, a minor arson attempt, a drug deal gone bad, things like that. It's just not sexy. When you get into the terrorism and war and SRCC sector, that's big dynamic violence, or it can be. And therefore, a lot of criminal violence just becomes what we call also onesies and twosies. And unfortunately, especially here in the United States, you get a section of a city like Houston, like Chicago, where the violence happens so often, the public just starts to accept it. And that kind of violent environment has a negative impact on the hotel sector. So because it happens a lot and it's not a big dynamic threat, and maybe politicians or the police force in these particular areas is either hamstrung or they're not terribly interested in clamping down on these things, then there you have it.
What you're describing it reminds me of just a recent episode I did on active assailant. But what you're describing is much more frequency rather than severity from an insurer's perspective, the language they would use.
Absolutely. So for example, there's a lot of murder suicides. And I've spoken to different insurance companies, different cleanup companies in different hotels, and they all have different approaches to these kinds of things. But eventually, if you have a lot of murder suicides or assault and battery in a hotel where blood gets in a room, in a Motel 6 or a 2-star kind of environment, a lot of times they'll just bring in these cleanup crews that are licensed by the state, and they'll clean up the blood and they'll be done with it. You're looking at a couple of $1,000s. If that happens a lot, then that costs add up, right? Maybe not for the Motel 6 where it happens. Maybe it's just an occasional thing that might happen once a year or once every other year. But for the insurance companies, these things really stack up. And if you're looking at some of the higher end hotels with the exact same scenarios, I've spoken to risk managers who said, oh, well, we get an incident where there's blood in the room. We don't just bother to clean up the carpet and get a new bedspread. We strip the entire room of FFE, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, right? FFE, strip the whole room out of a 4 or 5-star hotel, and we start all over again because we don't want any kind of biohazard to be in that room. And you're looking at something like that, that's $8,000 to $10,000 a pop. And again, the insurance companies are going to end up paying for this stuff. So for a single hotel where this kind of thing might happen just rarely on occasion, that's fine, but it's not okay for the insurance sector. These things stack up.
When I was planning this conversation, this section I think I called Mine the Protection Gap. You've highlighted that assault and battery exclusions as creating some major coverage gaps. What does that now mean for hotel clients and their general liability programs?
Well, it means you're not covered for assault and battery. And it also means you're not covered for sexual assaults either. So we frequently see somebody with a general liabilities policy at a hotel, and they're covered for fire and flood and maybe some kind of rain damage and things of that nature. But if you get somebody smashing somebody else in the face, getting into a fist fight in the lobby, and then there's got to be some kind of cleanup, there's got to be some kind of lawsuit, there's some kind of furniture damage or whatnot, you open up your policy and you say, well, let's file a claim. Jimmy beat up Tommy and we need to take care of this damage. And oh, by the way, Tommy wants to sue us for lack of security. You'll open up that policy and lo and behold, you'll find that you're not covered for assault and battery because it's been removed from the standard general liabilities policies. It's very difficult to get that. And this is one of the things that providers wants to do with our data. Providers is trying to put together, and they are actually in the process of putting together some assault and battery coverage for hotels, starting out in the Chicago area, and then they're going to expand. But you can't do this kind of thing unless you have really good data sets. And that means claims data, which is absolutely necessary. But if you're not going to use risk and peril databases like what we've got, you're missing about half the picture. And if we're going to thread the needle on something that happens a lot, we really need that robust expert intelligence. And that's one of the things that we provide.
Let's just look at a few real life incidents, as many or as few as you like, with one question in mind in particular. Are there some recurring fixable security failures from these different case studies?
Absolutely. So we'll talk about room access control, and then we'll talk about parties gone bad, because these are things that happen quite often. So very frequently, we will see a hotel front desk manager give a third party access to a room that third party is not supposed to have access to. So a guy and his wife check into a hotel, they have their electronic keys, they go spend time in the hotel room, et cetera, et cetera. And then at some point, some guy comes in and says, "Oh, my friends are staying in room 2022. They told me that you would give me the key." And the front desk will either give them the key incorrectly, or they will take them to the room and let them in. I just got done being an expert witness on a lawsuit against a hotel for this specific issue. I can't get into the details, but the hotel let this individual into somebody else's room where they set up a secret camera to record events inside the room. Massively illegal according to US law, but also against the policy of that particular hotel. Now, in this particular case, it was privacy violation and a security violation combined. But every now and then, you will have a hotel that will allow somebody into somebody else's room where a sexual assault will happen. And there's a very famous case where the crime happened in 2016. This was the Hyatt Regency in St. Louis at the Arch, where the Hyatt had hired a security manager with a criminal record. This security guy used his pass key to go into the room of a female sheriff's deputy and sexually assault her. Now, it was a massive security fail regarding hiring, which we see a lot in the hotel sector, but it was also a key fail. And this particular latter case ultimately resulted in a $177 million lawsuit. And so these kinds of things are indeed preventable. When we move on to parties gone bad, I'll give you two examples. And I'm going to pull these from the past. And there's a reason, and I'll tell you why. In October 2010, for example, Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Virginia, 3-star hotel, there was this Facebook advertised party where a bunch of teenagers were hanging out. One guy who wasn't invited, who was angry about it, and he was kind of the high school tough guy, he shows up with a firearm, starts trouble, and ends up shooting a guy in the parking lot over this. Again, that was 2010. December 2013, the Standard Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, which is a 4-star hotel, guests were denied access to a birthday party. Their feelings were hurt. Their egos were hurt. They opened fire, and a big fight and a lot of shooting occurred in the hotel room, in the hallways, in the elevator banks, and downstairs in the lobby. One was killed and 3 people were wounded. And so
You don't get this in the UK so much. Their feelings were hurt. They opened fire.
well, I make the joke, and it's a sad joke, but we Yanks, we have to be number one at everything, number one, and number two, we might as well be number one at hotel violence. And we are. It's a sad commentary on our social strata, but here we are. But the reason I bring up these cases from 2010 and 2013, this kind of thing happens every year. And this kind of thing happens about every other month. And so we see it a lot. So the security at the front desk, for example, regarding key control and access control to people's rooms, and security regarding not letting people have these wanton bacchanalia parties where people are bringing firearms and knives and whatnot into the hotels and getting into these fights. It's all preventable with the proper security and proper training.
Okay, so let's talk about strikes right civil commotion.
Yes, let's.
There's a bit of a spectrum damage, we call it, but the events can spiral quite quickly. So yeah, one of the strongest themes whenever we've spoken about these risks before is exactly that SRCC can escalate incredibly fast. So how should listeners think about that escalation curve? And why are hotels such a frequent target for it?
So first and foremost, SRCC is one of the most, if not the most, or the fastest growing form of violence insurance on the market. My understanding is that it has grown much faster than terrorism because it happens a lot. And indeed, it can get out of control. So the different spectrum of violence and the negative impact on hotels comes from the circumstances of each case. But there are trends and patterns that are recognizable. For example, in Mexico, there was a candidate who became the president, and then there were a bunch of leftists who didn't like it. This was many years back, and this included Black Bloc protesters and whatnot. So they rampaged through Mexico City, and they didn't just smash up hotels' windows, they smashed up restaurants and eateries and everything like that. And hotels just happened to be on the avenue where they were doing their violence. The same thing has happened here in Washington, D.C. The first time that Donald Trump won the presidency, anarchists, leftists, the Black Bloc came through different parts of Washington and smashed up some windows of restaurants, some Starbucks coffee shops, and some hotels. So sometimes the hotel is a victim of opportunity and victim of circumstance, if you will. And the property damage is, again, it's windows. However, those windows, the big windows that go from floor to ceiling, they can range anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the quality of the hotel. So it's not necessarily a minor thing to file a claim in that regard. Then you've got other circumstances where hotels represent either a political party, because everybody knows in this particular country, for example, and we'll talk about Ethiopia in just a moment, that a particular ethnicity or a particular political party is associated with that hotel. And the protesters and whatnot intentionally target said hotel. And then we've got circumstances like in the United States, and we'll bring this up as a case study in just a moment, where hotels represent money and power and the elite, and the oppressed, the people who are actually out there protesting, seize upon these buildings and say, you know what? You're sitting up here in your ivory tower with your beautiful grand piano down here in the lobby, and you've got a Ferrari or an Aston Martin or a Bugatti in the lobby. It looks beautiful. We're going to smash this up because you're the haves and we're the have-nots, and we're going to teach you a lesson. And the damage goes, like I said, anywhere from smashed up windows to overturned grand pianos and hotel lobbies to arson, where 20, 30 people can get killed and over 100 can get wounded. And I would say finally, on the reasons that there's this wide range of violence is because once you get a crowd into a violent state of mind, people stop taking responsibility for themselves. It's one thing to get in a fist fight in a parking lot one-on-one. It's also another thing for a terrorist group to center and focus on a hotel, get a raid squared away, get a raid built up, planned, and then execute it like Mumbai, right? Like the Taj Mahal, the Oberoi, the Trident. But when you have these feeding frenzies, if you will, of groups that are involved in strike, riot, civil commotion, it's like a school of fish that's going to seize upon a wounded fish, right? A piranha, whatnot. They just get into a frenzy and nobody is any longer taking responsibility for themselves. And the violence just gets out of control.
So let's look at some examples next that illustrate the range of damage you can get. So maybe picking on a few. So you mentioned the US quite a bit, but we've spoken about this before, and we've talked about Ethiopia, where there was an interesting case, as well as some really quite catastrophic destruction seen to a hotel in Nepal.
So a really good case comes from Ethiopia. In 2020, in June 2020, there was tension between different ethnicities in Ethiopia. And the aggrieved ethnicity, the aggrieved party, were a group of people called the Oromo. And one of their more outspoken political activists and a rapper had been assassinated. So a bunch of Oromos organized all over the country and started attacking non-Oromo businesses. And two of the businesses they attacked was the Shashamane Hotel, which was a 3-star, and the Haley Resort Z-Way, which was also a 3-star. And in the Shashamane, they burned this thing to the ground, and it was a beautiful resort. So we looked at all sorts of photographs of this thing before and after to do an analysis on the damages done. And it was just incredible. It was the kind of place that you would love to go. There were bungalows, there was a pool, there was all sorts of amenities, and they had a lovely restaurant there, et cetera. And it was out in the countryside. It was just beautiful. But it was totally burned to the ground. It was a total loss. And it was only rebuilt in late 2025. The other hotel, the Z-Way, again, a 3-star, it was partially set on fire, but it was mostly trashed by the human damages. So people inundated the hotel and smashed the place up as much as they could, right? And it took about 6 months for recovery in that regard. So in total, these riots killed about 239 people, more than 200 were injured, 12 hotels were thrashed, including the 2 that I just mentioned. But the damages at the hotels caused over 200 employees to lose work, and the damages were estimated at between 8 and 11 million US dollars. So that was pretty substantial.
We'll talk about Nepal next then, but the American examples, is BLM the primary example of when we've seen hotels being caught up in civil unrest?
Yeah, and during the BLM riots of the summer of 2020, that answer is a big yes. So scores of hotels were impacted all over America. But our big case study was the Hotel Bennett in Charleston, South Carolina, where the outside of the hotel was smashed up. The windows were smashed up. Some of the rioters beat up the hotel manager. And as the windows were smashed up, tear gas from the streets where the police had deployed anti-riot agents drifted into the hotel. And then there was a bunch of VIPs in the hotel. This was an exquisite hotel, by the way. It didn't get damaged more than I just said, but there were a bunch of VIPs in the hotel who had to shelter in place in a VIP room. And that's all well and good. But if you have a case like Ethiopia, and if you have a case like what we're going to talk about in a minute, Nepal, and somebody sets the place on fire, well, then you've got massive casualties on your hands. So, yeah, the BLM riots were bad for the US. And I would say more recently in America, especially in places like Minnesota, the anti-ICE protesters have also thrashed a couple of hotels. They haven't burned them down or anything like that, but they've done some lobby damage. And then there's privacy violations where some hotel managers or staffers have doxed the ICE agents staying at these hotels, which creates all sorts of lawsuits as well. The Nepal case is really unfortunate. September 2025, there were the anti-government Gen Z riots in Nepal. And instead of some hotels being targets of opportunity, we saw 20 hotels intentionally targeted by the Gen Z rioters, many of which were absolutely thrashed. And so for the purpose of this conversation, we'll focus on the 5-star Hilton Kathmandu. The damages to this hotel, you can look it up online. Just type in Hilton Kathmandu and up will pop this gorgeous building, frameless building. It was completely trashed and set on fire. The estimated losses are between $50 and $85 million, which was roughly how much it cost to build the thing in the first place. And Hilton says it is rebuilding the property. It is going to bring it back to life. But if your damages equal the amount of money it costs to build the property, it can be counted as a total loss event. Total insurance claims for all property damages are so far about $180 to $190 million in Nepal, 15 million of which has been paid out, and economic losses are over 500 million. And all across Nepal, through all these attacks, about 72 people were killed, hundreds of people were injured. Tourism collapsed, and insurance had just gone through the floor. It's a very bad situation for tourism and insurance.
I did as you suggested. I just Googled that while you were saying that about the Hilton. It said, Nepal's tallest hotel burned to ashes. And it genuinely looks like it's been hit by a missile strike because there's fire burning several floors up, and you can tell how burnt out, and you can just see the sort of skeleton through the different floors. Yeah.
Anytime we at Muir Analytics get photographs, especially before and after photographs or video of damage being done, that's gold to us because we can actually look at the property and estimate, the amount of damages done. So you don't have to be on scene to do it. It's always best, obviously, to have an adjuster do these kinds of things, but you can be somewhat of an adjuster with your computer screen and with the advent of social media. Yeah, that hotel totally got cooked. And I will add, burning a hotel like that, and we've seen terrorists do this, and we've seen SRCC malactors do this as well. It takes a little bit of lighter fluid and some matches or a lighter, and that's it, unfortunately.
When we're looking at this spectrum of hotel violence, Is there sometimes an issue of how things are categorized? I mean, you mentioned already the issue of exclusions within general liability, within wordings, within policy interpretations, but you think does lead to litigation.
So look at what we just talked about, the SRCC violence against hotels in Ethiopia and Nepal. And you could extend that also to the US. You've got the definitions of terrorism from the US government, the British government, the French government, et cetera. And then you've got Lloyd's definitions, which are very broad on purpose because they want to allow the individual underwriters, the carriers, a certain amount of leeway when they write their insurance policies because they are, after all, legal documents. So all the definitions of terrorism, though, whether it's Lloyd's or the US government or His Majesty's government there in the UK, all say something akin to violence being done to strong arm, intimidate, or force people to accept or agree with a particular political, social, economic, religious thing, like Al Qaeda and the 7/7 bombings, the tube bombings, and whatnot. You must follow Al Qaeda's ideology, otherwise, we will continue to kill civilians, etc. Terrorism. Well, when you have a riot situation, it's very similar to the definition of terrorism, especially when you look at something like the Ethiopia riots, because they were doing it for a social and ethnicity reason, right? They were conducting mass violence in this regard. And the same thing with Nepal. This was a pure political protest, and it turned hyper-violent in a hurry. So what is the dividing line between terrorism and SRCC? If you suffered all this damage at the Hilton in Kathmandu, and you have an SRCC policy, you can wave that in the air and say, okay, time to file a claim. Let's get our payout to rebuild our hotel. And we have this SRCC policy. It's going to at least cover some of the damage. Well, on the underwriting side, they could say that, no, this was an act of terrorism because it was a political violence, pure and simple. The rioters were angry at the government, and the people who did this weren't out in the streets waving flags and banging on cowbells and screaming into bullhorns. This was a very intentional and deliberate act of violence. We're going to categorize it as terrorism. And then you've got a giant problem. That is going to result in lawsuits. So what do? You can't just do this based on claims data, right? You've got to have a cornucopia, a breadth of violence intelligence, risk and peril intelligence from the hotel sector to look at these scenarios and go, okay, these are gray areas. What do we do? How do we write this legal contract so that it doesn't result in a massive lawsuit on top of the payouts that these folks are looking for? So therein lies the issue. And again, the solution is better data, better insights.
Well, we've already moved on to terrorism then. That's what I wanted to ask about next. Clearly, hotels do get targeted an awful lot. They are seen as prominent targets for attack, and it's a persistent or an ever-present threat. Could you walk us through a couple of representative attack scenarios of a coordinated bombing or an assault-style attack?
I would first preface this by terrorist attacks on hotels range the entire spectrum of violence. It can be a stabbing, it could be a shooting, it could be a strangulation, or it could be big terrorism, like what we're going to talk about in a minute. And I think statistically, it's also important to say that regarding terror attacks on hotels, 80% or a little more than 80%, right now our statistics say 82% of terrorist attacks on hotels result from groups or individuals with the mindset of Al Qaeda and ISIS, the Islamist jihadist mindset. And think about that statistic for a moment. If we didn't have Islamist jihadist groups, that would mean about 80 to 82% of terror attacks on hotels would never have happened. That's pretty astounding. At any rate, we've got small terrorism and big terrorism, and I'll run you through a couple of cases really quick. A small terrorism case would be Sousse, Tunisia, and we're mentioning this for a specific reason, because small terrorism here ultimately led to big terrorism. So small terrorism, Sousse, Tunisia, the Riyadh Palms Hotel, which was a 4-star hotel on the beach in Sousse, Tunisia, a suicide bomber attached to Ansar al-Sharia approached the beachfront. He had a suicide bomb. Security was very alert that day. They chased him off. He ran down the beach and blew himself up. And so the big terrorism case from Sousse, Tunisia comes from the 2015 case, June 2015, where an active shooter or a one-man raiding party He attacked the Riu Imperial Marhaba Hotel. Riu is a Spanish hotel company, but the hotel itself was the Imperial Marhaba. It was a 5-star. This guy came onto the beach hiding his AK-47 in an umbrella, yanked it out, started shooting people all over the beach in front of 2 hotels, eventually ran up onto the hotel property, shot people around the pool, entered the hotel itself. He had some homemade grenades. He shot a bunch of people. He ended up killing 38 and wounding 36. And the police eventually shot him on the back street of the hotel. I was actually part of the lawsuit against TUI for this particular case. And it represented a lack of good intelligence on behalf of the travel company TUI regarding sending people into a zone where terrorism and insurgency was very prominent, and they probably shouldn't have gone in the first place. If I had been security officer, I never would have said, yeah, go to Tunisia. It should have been a no-go zone, or the government maybe could have enacted enough security at the hotels and on the streets to help prop up the tourism industry in Sousse, Tunisia, which had been fantastic for a long time. But one terrorist attack can ruin it all.
Some incidents may meet a practical definition of terrorism, even if they're not certified as such by the government. Yeah, are there any good examples where that ambiguity comes into play and creates some challenges for insurers and insurers?
Well, sure. I mean, the case in that regard, one of the most prominent ones that comes to my mind right off the top of my head was the Boston Marathon bombings in 2016. Now, here we have a case of 2 brothers. They were partial to the ISIS ideology, and they made homemade bombs and put them in pressure cookers or rice cookers. I think they were pressure cookers. And they took them to near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. They detonated these devices, and thereafter began a major manhunt for both of these terrorists. Now, the explosions happened near hotels, and some of the debris happened to fall on top of hotels. And there were several hotels that had to actually shut down and increase security, and they tapped insurance to do these things because they were worried about other terrorist attacks happening all up and down the East Coast, which was prudent. Thank God it didn't happen. But the definition problem happens here. So, example, in the United States, the FBI said this was terrorism. The state police said this was terrorism. The Boston Police Department said this was terrorism. And they prosecuted it. They investigated it. They went after these 2 terrorists like it was a terrorist investigation. On the other side, the United States government did not certify this as a terrorist incident. So the US government version of Pool Re, you all have the Pool Re insurance there in the UK, terrorism insurance backed by the government, that in the United States didn't trigger. So if the government doesn't trigger an attack as terrorism, even though the FBI is calling it terrorism, the news is calling it terrorism, then the government terrorism insurance policies don't kick in. What do you do for standalone policies written by underwriters on the Lloyd's market or Bermuda or Singapore? These things have to be very well defined from the very beginning. And how do you do that? Well, you can look at a couple of case studies if you want, but a trend analysis is the best way to do that. So these problems pop up all the time.
In your experience, what are some of the most important risk mitigation or security measures for terrorism in hotels? Maybe point to one case study where you think they either worked really well or they failed.
So first and foremost, and we would hearken back to our Pentagon days. If you want to protect something, number one, or number two, if you want to conduct a military operation, intelligence is the absolute key. It's the foundation for all your ideas and actions, all of your planning. So if you understand the risk and peril intelligence trends regarding terrorism, that will be your starting point. You would then also have to understand your current risk environment and then apply best practices in hotel security. And it's interesting because there are no official government standards for hotel security in the US and a lot of countries, but Martin's Law there in the UK has finally kicked in, which requires some measure, some accommodation to government standards regarding crisis management and protection of large groups of people. And then finally, I would say applying security based on the threat at hand. So I'll give you an example. Around the Easter holidays, or it was Easter 2019 in Sri Lanka, ISIS terrorists detonated suicide bombs at several churches and at 4 hotels. They attacked the Shangri-La Hotel Colombo, the Cinnamon Grand Colombo, and the Kingsbury. And they hit with their suicide backpacks, their suicide bomb backpacks, the Easter buffet lines at these hotels. One bomber blew himself up at a budget hotel, the Tropical Inn, because his device didn't work at the other hotel that he had targeted. Well, the prevention part comes in regarding what I said earlier about being aware of the terrorism risks and perils and your current situation. So before these bombings happened there in Sri Lanka, there was a series of Islamist jihadist riots against Sinhalese Buddhist shrines and temples, and there were clashes between Sinhalese Buddhists and Islamist jihadists on the streets. So you already had this SRCC kind of situation, which was unheard of in Sri Lanka. Now, they did have the Tamil Tigers War that went on for quite some time, but Muslims versus Buddhists out in the streets was very rare. So that would be one of your risk indicators, one of your threat indicators that something was wrong in Sri Lanka. Then there were several other data points. 2 of them were the authorities, the police had discovered massive training camps for these ISIS sympathizers. And that represents a highly organized attempt to train a terrorist force and then deploy it in the field. And then finally, authorities had found caches of over 200 pounds of TATP explosives. So these 3 things, massively enhanced SRCC between Buddhists and Muslims, the training camps that they had discovered, and the cache of over 200 pounds of TATP, which is a terrible explosive, all in Sri Lanka. Hotels should have been up on alert because hotels are a very frequent target of terrorists, as we discussed. The hotels in Sri Lanka should have been up on alert. They should have had bomb-sniffing dogs, canine units. They should have had more security on the outer and the inner perimeter where people get out of their vehicles and to check into the hotels, luggage scanners, the whole 9 yards. They didn't do any of that. They ignored all the warning signs. And quite frankly, in a situation like this, if we were providing expert witness commentary on that, we would consider it gross negligence.
Let's move on to talking about war risk, especially as that's what's in the headlines at the moment in the Middle East. So give us an example of a hotel being hit by missiles, drones, artillery, whatever it may be, and explain why it was targeted or why it was affected.
So one particular case of a modern luxury hotel being hit by a missile, an S-300 missile in Ukraine, was on 30 December 2023 when the Kharkiv Palace got hit. Again, it was a Russian S-300 missile, and these things are as big as telephone poles. It slammed into this hotel and created incredible damage. And you can go online and look at the before and after pictures. It's just amazing the amount of damage that missile did. Why did the Russians hit it? There were foreign journalists and international personnel staying there. Russia sees that as foreigners providing aid and comfort to the enemy. So they decided to strike it, and they did. And they did, unfortunately, an amazing job on that particular hotel. More recently, as the Iran war has started, we've seen several strikes against hotels. The Crown Plaza Manama in Bahrain, which is a 5-star hotel, it got hit by a missile, and it's where a lot of American military personnel stay.
I've been there. I've enjoyed the cocktail bar there when I was deployed in Bahrain, yeah.
Outstanding. Well, thank God you weren't there, when it got hit by this missile. And the other one, the Fairmont, the Palm in Dubai, which is a 5-star, got hit by a drone. And the fascinating thing about this particular attack was there's 2 different videos online that show this Shahed-looking drone device hitting the hotel. And a lot of people tried to blow it off as just debris hitting the hotel, but it wasn't. There was no interception report up in the sky that you heard or debris falling down. There's actually video of this triangular object slamming down into this hotel. And again, the Iranians, probably the IRGC, are looking for foreigners, Americans, Jews, Israelis, and they're looking to punish their Arabian Peninsula neighbors who are not lashing out against the United States or Israel for these standoff strikes against Iran. And this is the way they're punishing their neighbors.
So in some cases, we've seen hotels being used by armed groups for meetings, whether it's, staging plans or logistics. Can you give some examples of that and how it might change the risk profile for the property and therefore the insurer as well from their perspective?
There's a lot of classic cases around the world for this. And I would say one of them comes from Yemen. When the Houthis were taking over Yemen, they were engaged in all sorts of battles against the Saudi Arabian military. And you had the Houthis were firing the rough equivalent of Scud missiles at Saudi Arabian airports and refineries and other targets. And the Saudi Arabians started striking back. Well, Saudi Arabian intelligence discovered that the Houthis were gathering in hotels on a very frequent basis, and they started hitting them with aerial ordnance dropped from F-16s. The shores of Midi Hotel was one of the venues, the Al Said Hotel, which was a 5-star, and then 2 of them were small budget hotels, which I can't even pronounce their names.
Hotels are good venues if you need a good sized meeting room or two or a boardroom type thing, and then some people who can bring out some food.
Some of these groups will actually use hotels as command centers. We saw Hamas do this in Gaza on a beautiful beachfront property. They had fortified it. They had used it as a command bunker. They had stored weapons in it. And when the Israelis came upon it, they ended up engaging in a huge firefight. And we've seen similar things happen in Pakistan, Colombia, Iraq, and Nigeria, and even in pre-war Ukraine. And in these circumstances, the hotel actually stops being a hotel. And I would say there's a parallel case. It didn't involve war, but involved a hotel in New York City that was bringing in refugees and homeless people. Well, there was a lot of biohazard and other types of damages done. The hotel filed a claim. The underwriter, which was in Germany, said, no, we're not going to honor this claim because when you started bringing in these homeless people and these refugees, you stopped being a normal hotel, which sees tourists and they see business travelers. Well, the same holds true for these hotels that we just talked about in Yemen, Pakistan, Colombia, Iraq, Nigeria, and pre-war Ukraine. If your hotel becomes the headquarters of an insurgent group, a political activist group, etc., inviting violence from your rivals, but you have changed the nature of the hotel from being a classic hotel into something else, a military headquarters de facto, which should probably negate whatever insurance policy you had to protect that hotel.
So much of what we've talked about today has been about blurring lines of definitions, for instance, between war and terrorism. I mean, particularly in insurgency or grey zone environments. So can you talk us through an example where that line has become blurred? Maybe give another example of that. What it might mean for policy triggers in particular, so exclusions and ultimately claims outcomes.
Absolutely. And I'll give you a technical example regarding data first. We had originally in our database labeled any attack by a technically sanctioned terrorist group like Al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia, as a terror attack. But as we got a little more down into the weeds regarding Lloyd's of London's definitions between war and terrorism and whatnot, we realized we had made a mistake, that an attack in Mogadishu by Al-Shabaab on a hotel, and it's a terrorist group, was not necessarily counted as a terror attack. The risk was not categorized as terrorism. The risk was categorized as war. And the same thing happened in the Iraq War. When the United States, when we went into Iraq, all hell broke loose. There was terrorism all over the place. There were all sorts of terrorist attacks on hotels and businesses and all sorts of other places. It was considered war zone insurance, not terrorism insurance. So nowadays, just for example, you can look at a very gray area, such as Thailand, right? So I did my PhD at Exeter, and my subject material was counterinsurgency in Thailand. And I looked at 2 wars that were over, but one insurgency zone that was still active, southern Thailand, right? The southern provinces that border Malaysia. So it's an active insurgency zone, an active terrorism zone. Every now and then you'll go for a week where there is some kind of attack every single week, and maybe the insurgents will lay off for a week or 2 and then they'll start attacking again. But it is an active violent zone. So technically, it can be categorized as a war zone under Lloyd's rules and regs for any kind of insurance being written there. But what happens when that insurgency dies down and there's almost no violence whatsoever going on for not just a few weeks, but a few months. And we've seen this happen in southern Thailand. And the groups that are doing this are terrorist groups, right? So what do you do regarding insurance for a hotel or a shopping mall or a rubber tree plantation storage facility where they're storing their sheets of rubber? What do you do in a situation like southern Thailand when the war dies down and there's all of a sudden an attack that comes out of the middle of nowhere 4 months later, right? Is it a terrorist attack or a war attack? Moreover, if this insurgency zone violence picks up, as it is doing right now in southern Thailand, and you see these insurgents, these terrorists, leave the insurgency zone and go to a place like Phuket, go to a place like Koh Samui, these beautiful island resorts, and stage a bombing. Is it terrorism or is it war, right? Is it spilled over from a war zone? And how is this approached? I haven't seen or heard anything other than court cases address these things directly. And the court cases are really nasty. And obviously, if you're in the insurance business or you're a policy holder, you want to avoid going to court. So the solution set is, again, you're not just looking at claims data to tell you how to write that policy or to help you analyze the risks and link premiums to the actual risks and the perils. You want to look at a whole series of case studies and trends to help you figure out, okay, the policy has to be written ideally in black and white language to avoid a lawsuit. So what do? We look at the case studies, we look at the trends in a place like Thailand, and we make a concrete decision. And we have to sit down with the broker, and we might have to sit down with the client, the insured, right? The person holding the insurance policy, and go, okay, look, you are in southern Thailand. Under certain definitions for Lloyd's, for example, this might be categorized as a war zone, but the conflict goes up and the conflict goes down. There's a lot of violence, and then all of a sudden there's no violence. So we, the carrier that is writing up this insurance policy, we are not going to categorize this as a war zone. We are going to categorize any violence that happens here as either SRCC or terrorism, and here's how and here's why, and make it really clear to the customer. Otherwise, you're looking at lawsuits galore, which is not a good place to be.
So just to close then, let's go through a few closing themes. So there are just a few points you'd like to drive home for those people listening who are underwriting hotels, against these malicious perils.
Because hotels are the world's most violent retail business sector, you have to have the best insurance and the best security possible. And you can't do it based on a few case studies. It's got to be done based not just on claims data, but you need that exquisite data and insights to help the underwriter, to help the broker, and to help the risk manager at the hotel, and to help the security manager figure out what bad things have happened at hotels in our peer group, number one, and number two, what bad things might happen to us in the future, and how can we prevent these things, and how can we write the best insurance policies to cover these things. Otherwise, it's too precarious a sector to just leave it to underwriting art. You have to have underwriting art. There's some of the best underwriters in the world, obviously, on the London market. You all invented this stuff. And the gut instinct and that kind of thing regarding writing policies is you have to have that, but it's got to be augmented by data science. And that's what we would advocate here, because it is such a violent industry. And unfortunately, look at what's going on around us now. Terrorism, riot, civil commotion, and violent crime is elevated just about everywhere all over the world. The world is not, unfortunately, getting safer. Who would have thought that 3 years ago, we would be talking about S-300 missiles, cruise missiles, et cetera, hitting hotels in Ukraine and drones hitting hotels in the Middle East and causing all this damage, and people torching $85 million hotels in Kathmandu. It just was unheard of years ago, but now it's actually commonplace. So having the best data and insights, exquisite data and insights to help negotiate these risks and perils is absolutely paramount.
Jeff, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on. You're a gentleman.
And that concludes this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Muir Analytics. I'd like to thank my expert guest for this special episode, ever the gentleman, Jeff Moore, CEO of Muir Analytics. Until next time, thank you for listening, and please tune in again. I've been your host, David Benyon, Production was by Peter McGill, and my cousin Lawrence Durkin made the music.